Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our conversation, Reimagining Unity in Black and Brown communities here in Chicago and Illinois. My name is Riyad Kazmi, and I am the moderator for the hour. I am a proud alum of the Impact Leadership Development Program at the Chicago Urban League, and so I'm honored as a man of color to be here today and someone who's married to a Latina. This is actually the first of other conversations that the Urban League and Latino Policy Forum will be hosting around Black and Brown community relations in our city and state. Some of those other conversations will be around coalition building, as well as legislative policies and actions that we can take as united communities. Now, since we are short on time, let's get into introducing our two distinguished panelists and truly boss ladies, Ms. Sylvia Puente of the Latino Policy Forum and Ms. Karen Freeman Wilson of the Chicago Urban League. Sylvia Puente is the executive director of the Latino Policy Forum, the only Latino public policy and advocacy organization in Illinois. Puente has earned a national reputation as a bridge builder and a trailblazer, having been recognized by Hispanic Business Magazine as one of the most 100 influential Hispanics in the United States. Puente is a proud Chicago native and is the first in her family to graduate college, earning a BA in economics from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She did graduate studies at Harvard Kennedy School of Government and earned her master's degree from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Puente was selected by Governor J.B. Pritzker to serve on his transition team and has served on numerous gubernatorially appointed commissions. Sylvia is a fellow of Leadership Greater Chicago and a recipient of a fellowship from the Chicago Community Trust. She's been awarded by U of I, U of C, LULAC, the Illinois Legislative Caucus Foundation, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and the National Museum of Mexican American Art, and not to mention the NFL. Sylvia, we're going to start with you here. In 2 to 3 sentences, can you please share with us what the Latino Policy Forum does?
Thanks, Rihad. Really appreciate that introduction, and it is making me blush. So the Latino Policy Forum promotes equity for the Latino community in the issue areas of education, housing, immigration, and most recently through a leadership academy that brings together Latino and African American community leaders to improve our city. And we do all this in concert with over 100 different, primarily Latino serving organizations who really advise our policy agenda for community impact and to have equity in our city and in our state.
Thank you so much. We're now going to move on to our other great guest. The Honorable Karen Freeman Wilson joined the Chicago Urban League as president and CEO at the beginning of this year. Having a deep commitment to public service, Karen most recently served as mayor of her hometown of Gary, Indiana. She was the first female mayor of Gary and the first African-American female mayor in the state of Indiana. Prior, KFW served as the Indiana Attorney General, director of the Indiana Civil Rights Commission, and presiding judge of the Gary City Court. Also, she served as executive director of the National Drug Court Institute and CEO of the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, where she is currently the board vice chair. The mayor, as we all know, referred to her as, is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. She is the immediate past president of the National League of Cities and past chair of the Criminal and Social Justice Committee of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Mayor, in 2 to 3 sentences, can you tell us what the Chicago Urban League does?
Absolutely, Rayad. And first, let me just thank Sylvia for the idea for our organizations to get together and talk about some things that are of such importance to both of our communities. And I want to thank you for being such an able moderator. And so in 2 or 3 sentences, the Chicago Urban League, for over 100 years, we have been advocating and quite frankly fighting for social justice and economic empowerment for Black families. And we do this through research and policy, through the development of programs, and through convenings like this. And our programming occurs in housing, employment, in business development, or our Center for Entrepreneurship, in youth services, and we do it through the Impact Leadership Program, of which you're an alumni.
Thank you so much, Ms. Karen. I appreciate it. So let's get into our discussion. We're going to cover three topics today. And the first we're going to talk about is one that we've all been impacted in one way or another, and that's COVID. So the Forum and the Urban League have been doing work around COVID and its disproportionate impact on our communities. So Karen, how do you advocate around COVID in the Black community?
Well, our advocacy around COVID started as early as March, and it was a result of what we were seeing with the quarantining that needed to happen, with the business closures and all of the shutdown. And it was clear that there would be a disproportionate impact in Black and Brown communities simply because we are so heavily engaged in the service industries. So when you talk about food service, when you talk about personal service providers, when you talk about attorneys, accountants, those individuals who really had to stop and were closed and then had to pivot their business model. And so our Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation began to think through, how do we help our businesses to pivot? How do we help them access dollars, revenue, PPP, and other sources of revenue that were available early on? And what type of advice can we give, either through technology, through marketing, through personnel support, that would help our businesses to sustain themselves during which we knew would be a critical period. In addition to that, through our Center for Research and Policy, we were able to develop a policy paper that not only looked at what was happening, but why it was happening. And so we looked at the impact of institutional racism on the incidence of COVID-19, quite frankly, the incidence of it and death from COVID-19 in the Black community, with implications, quite frankly, for the Latino community, but also not just to look at what was happening, but to look at how we might utilize our observations as a blueprint for going forward, and not creating or allowing this to happen to the extent that we saw it happening again.
Thank you so much, Karen. And just so everyone knows, I know Roberto from LPF put it in the chat, but if you have questions, there's a Q&A box that is easily accessible on your screen, or you can put questions in the chat and we will do our best to get to those after the end of the conversation. So Ms. Sylvia, how have you been able to advocate around COVID-19 in the Latino or Brown community?
Sure. Well, let me first of all say, echo Karen's sentiment and say thank you for moderating. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Karen, for I think what is an unprecedented conversation between our two organizations and our two institutions. So really appreciate your graciousness and taking up the offer to have this kind of public conversation. And I think it's just so important. I think we'll get to this a little later in our dialogue, but just being able to have a conversation is the first step, I think, to facilitating change and to promoting understanding. And I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do here. And obviously, I think never has there been a time for it more than the time we're in, given all that we know that's happening in the world and our nation, with the intersectionality of both the COVID crisis and the civil unrest, and all of what's contributed to the civil unrest that's happening in our nation today. So I know we'll talk about that a little bit further, but let me say that at the Forum, our core issues are education, housing, and immigration, and not health. But when we saw the emergence of the COVID crisis, I really felt that it was just so concerning and disconcerting, the disproportionate impact of COVID in both Black and Latino communities, that we had to do something. So we have pivoted internally at the Latino Policy Forum to really understand the impact of COVID on the core issues that we work on in education and health and in immigration. And as one example, in immigration, we did analysis that showed that 40% of Latino households in Illinois did not get access to the stimulus dollars, the $1,200 stimulus checks that came out earlier this year, because they may have had one or more member who were undocumented. That really is disconcerting. The economic impact of that for those families who are struggling obviously was huge, but especially disconcerting because we know that unauthorized immigrants in this state contribute at least $700 million to the Illinois economy. We had in our education agenda, we began to look at what is going to be the impact of COVID and remote learning on students whose first language is not English, and how do parents help their children if their first language is not English, and if they have limited broadband and computer capacity, which we know is an ongoing issue in many of our communities of color. So our amazing education team has worked diligently with educators around the state, collecting and hearing their points of view and their opinion and perspectives. And we have a whole series of recommendations that are on our website that speak to what are the considerations the school district should be thinking about to educate Latino and bilingual students remotely in this time of COVID. So we've come up with some concrete recommendations. We've also done that in the area of housing and the other area of other economic necessity, given that so many in our community have been displaced and aren't working. We also have worked with a group and helped to contribute to a coalition called Illinois Unidos, which is a much larger coalition of healthcare professionals, federally qualified health centers, doctors, physicians, who have been donating their time, volunteer meeting every other week to develop both a policy agenda for how to address COVID in the Latino community, but also advocating for more resources, more investment, advocating for longer hours for our testing centers, advocating for what's the best way to implement contact tracing, advocating for how we really seek to address and stem the tide, because we know that COVID is rampant in both of our communities. We've also been tracking the data. And as the end of last month, we were at about 3.3% of all Latinos in the state having had or had COVID, about 2.3% of all African Americans, and less than 1% of whites and Asians. So the rate of COVID in the Black and Latino community is 2 to 3 times greater than what it is in our white community. And there really are going to be significant long-term impacts of that, even as we're now seeing, quote unquote, as people recover from COVID, many have lingering health effects, which are impacting their ability to work.
So I guess the next question I want to kind of merge together for both of you. I know with Karen just joining the Urban League this year, there has not really been a ton of opportunities to collaborate and work together. And quite frankly, we'll talk about this later in the conversation, and it really has not been as strong of a collaboration amongst our two communities as it has been. Do you guys see this as an opportunity for there to be collaboration around the fact that you both have released reports, white papers, et cetera, on this? And so Karen, please feel free to answer that. And then Sylvia, feel free to chime in. We've got a couple minutes.
I think there are a multitude of opportunities for us to work together. And I think that we are natural allies. It's not always been that way. It's not always worked out that way. And maybe that's the good thing about somebody new like me coming to town and not necessarily being constrained by what has happened in the past, and Sylvia thinking similarly, what are things that we can do. I would also say that there is also a new coalition and emerging, the 2/3 coalition of Black and Latino leaders who are thinking in a very similar way, understanding that, you know, we're better together. I mean, it's just that simple. And I know it sounds cliche, but, you know, there are the issues that face us are so critical. When you talk about healthcare, when you talk about education, when you talk about employment, you know, it's easy for us to think of immigration as simply something that impacts the Latino community. But number one, when it impacts the Latino community, we ought to care. You know, Black folks ought to care, but more importantly, or equally important, I should say, is that there are Black immigrants that people rarely think about. And, so the allyship or the alignment of our interest and of the things that impact us are so important. And so, yes, COVID has impacted our opportunity to meet in person, but in no way has it impacted our opportunity to work together.
Echo, echo, ditto, ditto. And I would only add, I think that certainly, given I just think where we see the state as a nation and I think we both have an understanding of this. We see the widening wealth gap between Black and Latino communities and the rest of society, right? We see the economic fragility even before we got to COVID, right? We see that all the issues that you just mentioned, Karen, impact both of our communities in very, very similar ways. So yes, the Latino Policy Forum has had an intentionality, and I want to say this too. I mean, I want to be able to say Latino unapologetically, right?
Yeah.
And we are Latino advocates, and we're going to be Latino advocates, but it's not an either or, it's a both and, right? And that's really what I want to put on the end of it. It is a both and, right? Because we want to be able to advocate for the Latino community. We certainly, in launching our Leadership Academy, when we were planning it 5 years ago, I could not have imagined that where we would be today, would not have imagined that there would be even more of a need for Black-Brown solidarity than I probably have ever seen in my lifetime. So we have been intentional, we've been proactive. We are cultivating, I think, a new generation of Black and Latino leaders from our cities and our neighborhoods through the Leadership Academy that are committed to working together and are really already doing some amazing things. And we're very mindful. I mean, I've done my best to be very mindful as we stake out our unapologetically Latino roles and positions, that we're also inclusive of the Black community. We put out a statement right after the first civil unrest that we had earlier this summer that was, we did our best to be inclusive, to be allyship, to show solidarity with, and have a full commitment to being in solidarity with the Black community and with the Black Lives Matters movement as well.
Thank you so much to both of you. I mean, that really moves us into our second topic, which is going to be identity. And so I'm going to have very quick question for either of you. Please provide your first answer that comes to your mind, and then please feel free to explain it. Now, I know what I prefer, but Karen, do you prefer Black or African American?
So that's interesting that you would say that, because before Stephanie Schmitz-Beckler educated me, I would say African American woman. But I am a Black woman, and I say that because I want to make sure that people understand that I am aligned with other Black women. And so it may be African American, but it also may be Afro-Caribbean, or it may be other Black women who are in the US and have had a similar experience. And so, I think it's important to understand that. And like Sylvia, I also believe that it's important to understand that you can be an advocate for Black people, for Black families, and do it in alignment and as an ally to other oppressed and disadvantaged, or folks who have been really oppressed historically, like Black folks have done, and not take away from either, right? So often I see efforts to pit us against each other, to say that we're going to support this cause now, and then we're going to support your cause later, or that February is Black History Month, and June is, I believe they call it Hispanic Heritage Month. And here's what I would say: every month is our history. Our history is important And so, you know, it's important to highlight it during certain times of the year, but we need to understand that our history is important 365 days of a year, both of our histories.
Thank you so much. Now, Sylvia, for you, is it Hispanic or Latinx?
It's Latina. I'm
I
Latina.
love it. Good job, Latina.
I'm Latina. As a group, we are Latino, right? And I understand, and I guess I want to premise my remarks by saying that, you know, this whole process of how we call ourselves as quote unquote minority groups in this nation is a term that's in the process of development, right? I mean, a long time ago, there still is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, but I don't think we would ever use that term when we're referring to people who are Black and Black Americans. So I think it is a process of the formation of identity over time, given the context of the times, and given the context of the times where we are now also into, and I understand that Latino, many see that as a very gender-specific language, and that many of our younger people, many of the people from our queer community, many of the people are saying Latinx, right? And that X removes the gender identity of what is this term of Latino or Latina. So I've had this conversation with my daughter, who is a millennial, and I will respect your right to call you what you want to be
I have
called.
one of those too.
And if it's Latinx, or if it's whatever the term is, I will do my best to honor that and respect that. But then you also must honor and respect what I choose to call myself, right? And understanding that in this monolithic group, that Latinos are not a monolithic group, right? And that we have this diversity of perspectives in terms of what we call ourselves. So I used to fight a long time ago about Hispanic and Latino. I don't fight anymore. But the genesis of Hispanic for me is a government made up word, which I choose not to use. I am a Latina. My organization is the Latino Policy Forum. But bottom line, I think we do need to respect what people are choosing to call each other at this moment in time that we're in, given that so much of this new terminology is being is a result of what we're seeing around all the gender identity issues that are emerging, which 20 years ago I couldn't even have conceived of. The term I'm struggling with a little bit, and I don't know how you feel about it, Karen, is this term BIPOC, right? I don't even know if that's how people are saying
I
it.
wasn't even, just so you know, I wasn't even going to ask that question.
You can ask it.
But feel free, please.
Black,
people
Indigenous,
of
people of color, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess I just want to say, in our rush to be politically correct, let's just ask people what their preference is. Mm-hmm. And in fact, most Latinos will not even say they're Latino. They will say whatever their country or their parents'
what country
origin is.
Sure.
Whether I'm Venezuelan or my parents are from Venezuela or from Mexico or Cuba. So there is no one term for this very diverse group. And it really is about asking people what their preferences is in terms of how they choose to call themselves and what they call themselves.
I think Sylvia raises such a great point as well about the intergenerational thinking around this issue. I said I have a millennial too, and they're thinking about so many of the challenges that we're confronted with differs from ours. And the ability to respect that about our identity and about so many other things. One of the discussions is defunding the police, and they look at things a lot differently than many of us do. I think is important because if you have the dialogue, then you can do so much around solving some of the problems that we're facing.
No, you're 100% right. I mean, it really makes you think about this, and this is the question for you is really how terms impact our identity. Sylvia, you mentioned Hispanic, a government name. Karen, when we had said African American, like you said, it's not respectful to other cultures that may be there. But in a way, why does it have to be African American? At the end of the day, we're all Americans. We just may be different colors and shades. And so, do you think that these terms impact our identities and how we're perceived as a community? I know you answered a little bit of this, but could you please go in a little bit around that of how the identity is impacted by terminology?
Well, I think it is. And quite frankly, sometimes the identity, and I think you talked about BIPAC, the indigenous African people, I think that um, is used on occasion, and other terms are used to divide us, quite frankly. Because if we can, separate folks out, then it's a lot easier to fight folks who are not united. But if we come together and identify ourselves, uh, yes, you have separate identities within the group, but understand the power and the ability of the group to really do more when you come together, then I think that that's what makes us powerful. And that's what we have to remind ourselves and, quite frankly, each other. And when people start to kind of develop subsets of folks, then you find that that often engenders disunity. And at this day and time, we just can't afford that.
I would agree. And I think the only thing that I would add to that is, I think obviously what we name ourselves and what we call ourselves, our own perception of our identity is critically important. And I think that everyone should define what that is for themselves, whichever terms they choose to use, because having that solid foundation of identity, whether it's your racial identity, your gender identity, your ethnic identity, your class identity, I think keeps us rooted and grounded. And I think the only thing that I would add to that is this idea that we're never going to have total unanimity in the Latino community, and I would imagine in the Black community. We're just too diverse for that. But what the Latino Policy Forum tries to do, I say, where do we have common ground, right? And with how many groups and how many allies and how many interest groups do we have common ground on what I think is our shared agenda, which is an agenda of equity, which is an agenda of inclusion, which is an agenda of access, right? And ultimately is an agenda for how do we really ensure that those in our community have enough to eat, have a place to sleep, and are treated with dignity and humanity.
No, I love that. And that really is a very easy segue into, the last question on this topic before we move into our final topic prior to Q&A is really, you both hit this nail on the head. A lot of this terminology has been utilized to divide us, right? And that's what has been the history of America. And this country is creating divisions so that a certain group, can stay in power. So how do we change that beyond a conversation that you're doing now today and you're going to do forward? What else can we do to unite our two communities so that we can build a strong united front that does take power and does take hold?
Yeah. I guess I just want to, there are lots of things, right? I want to say, and just add on to my remarks, that I don't want to do this in a colorblind way either, because I don't think that's the solution either, where we don't acknowledge that there may be differences, even in the colorism within the Latino community, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that we certainly don't acknowledge it. We don't not acknowledge it, that there is differences based on colorism and that there are differences based on class. But, the first step to doing it is you've got to be able to talk to each other and you've got to be able to have a conversation. And then I think we've seen numerous instances where we have seen Black and Latino communities around the city come together. North Lawndale and South Lawndale, I know, have historically done things together. When the Little Village High School was being built, there was a huge debate on should the boundaries include just Little Village or should it cross between Little Village and North Lawndale, so that students, predominantly Black in North Lawndale, could come to the Little Village High School, right? So how do we create the places and the spaces where we are more in touch with each other on a regular and consistent basis? And then obviously, how do we bring that into the public space? How do we bring that into our policy space? How do we bring that into our political space? I think are all the places where we need to be having those conversations. Because, Chicago is just so interesting, and we all know that Chicago has just such a history of segregation. But when you look at Black and Latino communities on the East Coast and the West Coast, I don't think the divisions are quite as acute sometimes as they are here, because you're living in the same neighborhoods. You go to LA, you go to South Central, right? Black and Latino folks are living right next to each other. You go to any Black in New York, right? Black and Latino folks are living right next to each other. So just that proximity of space and getting to know each other and being able to share, I think is just so critical and important.
I agree with Sylvia. Segregation has had such a debilitating impact just on our ability to communicate and to understand each other. And the fact that so often solving a problem starts with just talking to someone, right? Just sitting down and having a conversation like we're doing, but being able to have the level of proximity that would facilitate that conversation, not just as a discussion like we're doing today, but because you're going in and out of the house and you see a neighbor on a regular basis. And so you're talking to them not just about, some policy issue, but you're talking to them about their children or what's happening at school. And you find out that your values are very similar and your aspirations for your children are very similar, and what you're doing to care for your parents are similar. And out of that comes this connection that will allow you to get so much done together. We don't have that ability often in Chicago because of this separation of the races, because there has been this intentional segregation that has happened over the course of time. And so now we have to curate these discussions and curate the relationships that will ultimately allow us to work together.
That's great. Really quickly before we move into our last topic, which is civil unrest, if you have questions, everyone, please feel free. There's a Q&A symbol that is on the screen. Please feel free to type in there. And if you're unable to find that, please feel free to put it in the chat. But moving on now to civil unrest, you both, Sylvia and Karen, talked about the generational divides and you both having children who are millennials. Since you mentioned the generational divide in regards to some of the police brutality or defunding police, we even talked a little bit touching on the perception of what all has been going on from a protest perspective. But what would you say in regards to conversations about healing and about trauma? Now, when you think about both of our communities, it traditionally has not been something that especially younger people, whether they're millennials or even my generation, who's the end of that millennial generation, we weren't really, the generation before us was not really hip, right, to trauma and talking about it. It wasn't cool to be a brother going to get counseling, right? It's a little different now, generationally, and the younger folks are a little more inclined. Could you guys please speak to that in regards to some of your experiences with talking about trauma and conversations, whether you want to do it from a generational perspective or even just from you and your organization specifically?
Yeah. You want to start, Karen, or?
I'll defer to you, Sylvia.
All right. I've thought a lot about this, right? And I am a baby boomer. I am of that generation. And I really need to give respect and props and credit to what I'm learning from the young people who have taken to the street, to the people younger than me who have been through our leadership program. I remember the first year of our leadership program, that one of the projects that some of the participants wanted to work on was to create a healing space for women to talk about their trauma and how do they process it, how do they address it, so that they could be more fully present as they were change makers in society. And I just remember being a little floored to think, oh my goodness, they're taking to name that there's a need to have a public space, to go from a private space to a public space to talking about trauma and what it meant to them as women of color. I just thought was so brave and so courageous. I think that over the past 4 to 5 years, we really have seen, and we know this, we're seeing it more, right? That we understand even more from a scientific perspective that we do carry generational trauma with us, given the trauma that each of our, and the hardship that each of our communities have faced. And that we have to heal from that if we're really going to be able to be change agents in society. So for me, it's been pretty significant, and I would even say profound, to think about taking that from a private space to a public space. Because personally, I long have held the belief that I can't help to heal or repair or improve a community if I'm not, don't have good mental health, if I'm not healing and taking care of myself, right? And I've done that in a variety of ways in my private space. But now to be able to talk about it publicly is, I think, it's a whole new step forward, I think. You know, and oftentimes I will ask people these days, given everything that's going on, how is your mental health? How are you taking care of yourself? I couldn't have imagined doing that even just a few years ago. So I think it's the rhetoric, the words we use, the sentiment of the words, and especially the words we're using about how do we take public the need to address racial healing and trauma. How do we take public? And again, I give props to our Leadership Academy, who have been doing peace circles, who have been doing meditation circles, and all of the other initiatives that are unfolding around that in the city from so many different communities.
Thank you. Karen, what do you think?
You know, we come from a generation and even a people who have been taught to suffer quietly. You know, what happens in this house stays in this house. What are you communicating, right? And we understand that when people deal with trauma in that way, there's nowhere for it to go but inside, and to create this self-destruction tendency or self-destructive tendency. And so we have to be very, very careful. And I think that there is a lot of value, and there are so many lessons that we can learn from subsequent generations who have said, we want to process this openly because we don't want it to continue to happen. Most recently, I had a conversation with a young woman who I've mentored for a long, long time. And she's a mom of small children now. And she talks about not spanking those children. That was foreign to me, right? But I had to stop and think how that decision is so important and so courageous, to not perpetrate or perpetuating rather violence in our community. And it, you know, people have cited the Bible for ages, spare the rod, spoil the child. But the reality is that when you normalize that type of behavior, you only perpetuate it, right? And what it's hard sometimes for kids to distinguish between, you know, a spanking for something that I did versus, you know, hauling off and hitting a classmate versus picking up a weapon and doing something. And there is a cycle that occurs. And so I think that there is a lot of healing. And when you look at the civil unrest, you know, I'm often reminded of Marvin Gaye's line, make you want to holler, throw up both your hands. And, you know, I don't think that folks really understand the source. I don't think that some people, and largely majority people, understand the source and how deep the source of that frustration and anger is. And, you know, they began to debate, well, you know, well, you're tearing up in your own community, or I didn't do anything to you, and you're doing this in a way that is not necessarily advancing the cause. But, you know, when you have had it beyond here. You know, I'm not talking about having it up to here, but all the way beyond here. It's hard to make those distinctions, and that's where we can step back at some point where it's appropriate and have the conversation to help sort of direct it. But, you know, don't criticize it unless you really do understand it.
Agreed. You know, I was not very familiar with the term microaggressions. And, you know, again, one of the newer terms that we're using, and realize it's the accumulation of little harms, little injuries, little hurts that accumulate over time. So then the response to them becomes, to the last one, to the most recent one, becomes an outside disproportionate response to that particular injury, that particular harm, because it is the accumulation of all those harms, as you were sharing, Karen. And for me, that's just something that I'm just much more aware of in terms of just thinking about, oh, that's what it is. That's why I'm getting so upset right now, right? It's not what just this one person said to me, right? It is the accumulation of all the other people who have said the same thing to me over time and over the years. It is the accumulation of those microaggressions. And not that it is needing to understand that, I think, some of the civil unrest and some of the rage that we've seen erupt. It's been brewing for a very, very long time.
So then what I would say is, so we can get into our audience portion and it be pretty engaging. Really quickly, you all have touched on this, but with this being titled Reimagining Unity in our Black and Brown communities, what does reimagining unity mean to you? And the reason I'm saying as few words as possible is because it can mean lots of things. But in as few words as possible, Karen and Sylvia, what do you think reimagining unity is to you?
What comes to mind immediately for me is, you know, when people talk about set aside programs, right? And whether it's 5% or 10%, every now and then it's as much as 20. And instead of fighting over that 20% or 10% or 5%, let's band together and go get our share of the 90 or
I
the
love it.
80. You know, that
Right.
in a nutshell.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Sylvia, what do you think?
Well, I guess I want to say something that for me really has been brewing, is that I'm so thankful to the young people who have given me the language to now be able to claim and say things like white privilege, institutional racism, and structural racism, that we have lifted the veil on saying those terms and using them in polite company. And that it's not directly related to your question, but I think it's so important to this conversation that we be able to have honest conversations around what those terms mean and everything related to them for each of our communities. So with that, I think the reimagining, to what Karen is saying, it's not going back to the way it was. It really is reimagining that we have much more in common than divides us. It's reimagining that we want the same things in terms of stability and a good house to live in and a good and secure job. But it's reimagining this thing that I think comes from a deeper place, which for me is, I'm going to use these words that may or may not make sense to people, but moving from our tribalism to our universality and understanding the universality of our shared humanity. To me, that's what reimagining, part of what is involved in reimagining.
Great, thank you so much. So we've got some questions coming in. I do know that, Sylvia, there is a piece of artwork that you wanted to highlight very quickly before we did the Q&A to also spur some of that. So LPF team, could you please put the piece of artwork really quickly up on the screen, and we'll let Sylvia say a few words about it, and then we'll move into Q&A.
So I'm going to embarrass my daughter, who I think might be listening. She is an emerging artist, and I claim full nepotism, and that this is
Awesome. I love this.
But I think, right? I mean, it's not just because she's my daughter.
Yeah, no, she's good.
But she did this. She lived in New Orleans for a good number of years, and in this time of COVID has created a whole series of prints. And this one, I just think is just so in tune. And art is just such a powerful, art speaks more than words, right? So there's so much going on here in terms of the Black and Brown unity, right?
Right.
That she has each of the images, the with the angel wings and surrounded by flowers, that there is this heart connection of Black and Brown unity, as well as this energetic connection that's happening between their hands. And then she also has a little bit of the symbolism for the third eye. So what's going on beyond what you can see and not see in terms of our interaction as Black and Brown communities, but also most profoundly and most simply, it just is, how you doing? All righty, yourself? You heard me? Heard. That we hear and listen to each other.
That's it.
You know, that's so awesome, because the first question, I think this sums it up quickly. The first question we received was from Evelyn Freitas, and she said, how do you get people to buy into the idea of unity and diversity as a good thing? And quite frankly, the artwork says it enough, right? Nothing needs to be said if you look at it. And so, Evelyn, we thank you for that question. That is a simple way. Artwork is just spending time with one another. It's understanding each other and respecting each other. So we definitely appreciate the question. Another question we've got from one of our listeners is from Jose or Josu Barba. As a millennial, and this is going to be a very good question for you guys since you have daughters that are millennials, how can we in our respective communities logistically create bonds with our African-American hermanos and hermanas to push mutually beneficial legislative proposals? I know it's a mouthful. Sylvia, please feel free to answer. And Mayor, you do the same since you are the elected official here. Go ahead, Sylvia.
Well, you know, part of it is, again, we have to acknowledge what we have in common. And in both our Black and Latino caucuses at both the state and city level, figure out where our proposals that really advance our agendas of economic prosperity for each of our communities. And how do we just, you know, it is as simple, but as profound and as challenging and difficult of how do we work together.
Awesome.
There are no easy answers, there are no solutions, but it doesn't start until at the political perspective, our caucuses come together. And then for organizations like mine, and I'm sure the Urban League does this too, as we advance our proposals, making sure that we're talking to our Black and our Brown legislative leaders to gain their support.
I absolutely agree. And then I would, and former elected official, I mean, you know, I don't want to have anybody give me responsibility for anything that I don't want to worry about the snow or the garbage. But, you know, I think that it's important that we facilitate the opportunity to understand each other. So going back to the earlier conversation, so that we can discuss those things that are important to all of us. So as an example, we both have leadership programs, right? The Urban League has one, the Latino Policy Forum has one, facilitating the proximity of those two groups. And I know that Sylvia has long talked about a reception, right? And then I know that there are youth groups in both communities, multiple youth groups, and facilitating the proximity of those young people to begin to discuss those issues that are important to them and to say, hey, you know what? I think this is something that we can get together about and go to Springfield, go to City Hall, go to the county building so that we can achieve a shared goal.
That's awesome. We've got another question from Jose Alvarez. If we can agree that part of the biases of racism is fear and ignorance, how do we in the Black and Brown community overcome the fear and ignorance which is keeping our communities down? For example, our communities not participating in the census due to the fear and ignorance which keeps so many people from participating.
You know, I think each of us has to take it upon ourselves to educate both as an individual and in a corporate way together. So, you know, obviously the Urban League was heavily involved in the census throughout the state. And one of our last acts was to do tables in West Inglewood, and we did that with some of our Latino brothers and sisters to talk one-on-one to residents. But I know that, I encountered young people who said to me, "Oh, I'm not participating in the census. They just want to track you." And so I have to stop and have that conversation. "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Yeah, they're looking to count you, but they're not going to track you down because there are these safeguards in place and this is what's happening." And to really take the time rather than simply saying, "Oh, that doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about?" So you can explain it to people so that they can in turn explain it to their friends who they talk to, because they got that somewhere, right?
So
Yeah,
here's
and
one for you, Sylvia.
Mhm.
Oh,
No, go
go
ahead.
ahead, Sylvia. I was going to say something for you. Can you comment on the role of forgiveness in building a new future?
Whew, that's deep.
I know it's a tough one.
Well,
This
you
comes
have
from
to,
a question from Lynn Monte. So thank you for the question.
thank you. So I think the role of forgiveness, forgiveness for me is about when the pain or harm, I stopped carrying the pain or harm you were trying to inflict on me. And I no longer give the pain and harm you're trying to inflict on me power over me. So it doesn't acknowledge that the fear or harm or the assault or whatever it is didn't happen. But it means I get to a place in myself where that I no longer give that control over me and how I respond, right? It is ultimately, how do we come to our place of love and forgiveness, and again, shared humanity.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Well
This is a
stated.
question. Yeah, for sure. This is a question for actually both of you. So Karen, you can go first, and then Sylvia. With this trauma-informed and healing lens, and you both had explained it and talked about it, applied to our collective work, what is the role in both the Latino Policy Forum and the Chicago Urban League in incorporating a disability justice lens, as disabilities have sometimes been left out?
Yeah.
Wow. You're taking me back to my Civil Rights Commission days.
You're exactly
And
right.
there is absolutely a void often of discussion about disability and the inclusion of disability in many of our discussions. And so what I would suggest is that we have to be more intentional about understanding that that form of discrimination still exists. It certainly exists in both of our communities and against both of our communities, as some people suffer from discrimination based on race, gender, disability. And when you combine all three of those, then you really have a challenge on your hands. And so I think we have to really be intentional and inclusive as we do our work.
Agreed. I mean, I can't say it any better, right? It is about being mindful and inclusive of all of our communities, both with disability, with LGBTQ, with all of the sectors of our diverse communities, and that as we pursue our policy agendas, we make sure that they are inclusive of all of our communities.
That's awesome. Thank you both for that. We have a few minutes left. There was one comment I would like to read to you all. It's a question, but really to me, it's kind of a comment from Daniel Bassel. And it says, how are your organizations trying to connect leadership group members with each other via hashtags similar to Reimagining Unity? So when I see that question, it really makes me think, have both organizations thought of a way of, since you both have leadership programs, of bringing those groups together to try to be part of the next generation to carry forward, excuse me, a true lens of unity and an actual belief and want for it?
Yeah, I would, the Latino Policy Forum is reimagining its leadership program for this year, and we've had 10 years of leadership programming to date. And our goal for this year is, rather than bringing in a new cohort, is to figure out how we bring together, anyone who's gone through a leadership program knows you're really bonded to the people in your cohort. Now, how do we really think about creating that bond in that bridge of our 10 years of cohorts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, as Karen has said, we also have done outreach with the Impact Leadership Program and others, and have had several events where those participants have had the opportunity to come together. It's been mostly in an informal social settings to date, but the idea is, how do we get more intentional around that on projects that we can work on collectively, on common language that we can use? Like, I think we have our new hashtag, Reimagining Unity.
For sure, for sure. I think that there is certainly an opportunity with our leadership programs that we can build upon. Um, Most recently, we've developed through our Golden Fellowship Exchange. Every year, everybody knows that the Urban League has this huge event called the Golden Fellowship Dinner. Well, that's going to be different this year. It's going to be totally virtual. But the day before, we thought that it was important, and I think that this may provide a basis for that, to have intergenerational conversations, right? Because we learn so much from those who are older and younger. And why not have that intergenerational conversation between the Latino community and the Black community? And one of the things that we thought about, we have a youth services division cultivating a conversation with Black youth and Latino youth. So I think that when you get generations to talk to each other, then it becomes just a matter of fact. And when that becomes a matter of fact, then, the conflict or the separation that existed in the past immediately disappears. And maybe
That's
not
awesome.
immediately, but
Right.
gradually disappears.
Which is the goal.
Yeah.
So we are actually about to tune off for 1 second, but I wanted to say this before I give you each about 20 to 30 seconds to close. Remember, for the audience, this is not the only conversation that's going to occur. This is one of many that the Urban League and Latino Policy Forum are planning. And so please tune in and look out for those updates. But Sylvia, in 20 to 30 seconds, what would you send as a send-off to our guests? What would you say?
I'm thankful for the opportunity to have this conversation. I think that the Latino Policy Forum at 11 years old is a baby compared to the progress of the Urban League, and want to honor, acknowledge, and respect that. But I think that we know, and Karen said it, our communities can accomplish much more united versus being divided.
Karen?
I would once again thank Sylvia, thank you, Rayad, and thank everyone who has tuned into this conversation. And I want to end with something that I learned from Sylvia the first time we met. We did a town hall on ABC 7, and we were talking about what happens after COVID-19. And I think the word that I used was recover. And she said, no, we don't want to recover. We want to transform, right? And I immediately embraced that and have been using that ever since. And so I would hope from this, and from this series that we create, and from the partnership that grows out of here, that we can transform and continue to transform both communities.
Sylvia Puente, Latino Policy Forum, thank you so much. Karen Freeman Wilson, Chicago Urban League, thank you so much. Everyone who tuned in, have a great rest of the week. Bless you, and continue to look out for more upcoming webinars. Be safe.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Big
Thanks,
hugs
everyone.
to everybody.
All right. Yes.
Blessings.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.